Hello. All right, guys. Thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to be talking about kind of the future of infrastructure from the perspective of a venture capitalist, at least, Andreessen Horowitz. And this is kind of two talks squished together. I'm going to talk a little bit about infrastructure in general. Then I want to talk about open source and how these dynamics are changing. Unfortunately, this has a potential of being a very short talk. I mean, if you talk to prevailing wisdom, infrastructure is dead, and it has been dead for a long time. If you think about it, let me see, IT budgets have been down to flat in recent memory. I think, what is it, IBM has posted something like 16 quarters, I'm trying to fix this, of quarter-on-quarter losses. I mean, this has been kind of the prevailing wisdom from many aspects, whether I'm talking to vendors or I'm talking to customers, I'm talking to operators, I'm talking to venture capitalists. We've kind of seen this doldrums in infrastructure. And a lot of it is people don't understand what cloud means, and a lot of it doesn't understand. They say, well, listen, if you have one monopoly that's going to be providing infrastructure for free or for very low cost, like where's the room for everybody else? And I was caught into this general malaise for a while as well. I'm like, well, what else is there to do in infrastructure? I mean, we've done a lot of the core technologies. But the more I've spent, especially in the last couple of years, looking at it, being part of the buying cycle, shipping product, and now investing and talking to a lot of startups, I actually think that view is dead wrong. I actually think that we're in somewhat of a golden period of infrastructure. I think actually we're at the cusp of one of the biggest renaissances in all of infrastructure. And what we're seeing is not death, it's transformation. And I want to talk a lot about that. But I mean, just to tee up one number, I mean, if you look at just public cloud and SaaS, it's about a $220 billion market right now, which is huge, right? It seems very large. But if you compare it to the IT budget is $4 trillion, right? So we're about 6% of the way on a transformation. And every time you have a transformation of that size, I mean, the history of computation is punctuated by these types of transformations. Every time you have a transformation of that size, two things happen. Markets grow. That's clearly happening as we go to mobile and Internet of Things. But also new technologies rise, incumbents fall, and new challengers take the stage. And I think we're at this very privileged position now that the new sets of challengers that are bringing infrastructure to market have an unfair advantage. I actually don't think it's ever been easier for a technical-based startup to have a huge impact in infrastructure. And so that's going to underlie a lot of my talk. So what I want to do is I want to talk about three trends I believe are shaping the landscape. And each one of these, I want to talk about why it gives new incumbents an unfair advantage, one that we haven't had before, certainly in the last 2 decades, to disrupt and have impact in the infrastructure space. Okay, so the first trend I want to talk about is the software-defined movement. I've kind of lost track of what software-defined means, so I'm going to go ahead and make up a definition here. This is not to define software-defined for everybody. This is for the purposes of this talk. So to me, what software-defined is if you can implement functionality and you can distribute it fully in software, it's software-defined, right? That's it. You can implement it in software, you can distribute it in software without wrapping it in sheet metal or sticking it in hardware, then it's software-defined. Simple. So it looks like, especially over the last 5 years, infrastructure is going through the same type of transformation that consumer tools went in, say, the early to mid-2000s. So do you guys remember GPSs? Right? Yeah. Yeah, you rent a car, you didn't know where to go. You get a GPS, you put it on the dashboard, it'll tell you where to go. So this was a massive industry. And what happened with the advent of the iPhones is small technical startups that just focused on software or services were able to disrupt a special purpose device. And the reason is because you had this ubiquitous hardware platform. So back in the early 2000s, if you look just in the consumer space, most digital devices were fixed function, whether that was for games, if that was for health, that was for GPS, that was for learning. You guys remember the portable game machines or the portable learning tools, and all of that kind of massive, highly verticalized industry got disrupted once everybody had in their hand a phone that would allow you to run arbitrary applications and had enough I/O and input to allow for sophisticated use. And so what you saw these small companies, like let's take Waze, for example. So Waze was founded in about 2007. It took 3 rounds of funding, total I think about $70 million. Within 5 years, it had 50 million users. It was acquired by Google, I believe in 2013, for $1 billion. I mean, you don't normally see meteoric growths of companies like that unless you're able to get access to users with a function they understand very quickly. I mean, like, think about how you would compete with this. Let's say you're Tomcat or someone that's doing a GPS device. In order to actually refresh hardware and get it to a customer, I mean, you've got to, something probably in Taiwan goes in a shipping container, which goes on a ship, and the ship goes across the ocean, and then it goes to a warehouse, and then that warehouse, it sits there in large inventory, probably goes on some more shipping trucks, and it gets to the customer. And if you want to have some change in the software, you've got to refresh that entire supply chain. So what I find really interesting is infrastructure is following the same pattern. And this is a relatively new thing. So it used to be the case way back when that the only common interface, if you walked into IT or an IT data center, was Ethernet or IP, right? I mean, that's why you have events like, say, interop. And so the only way to kind of plug into infrastructure, like, okay, the only common interface that I have is IP, so I'm going to go ahead and take some sheet metal, I will wrap that around my functionality, and I will go ahead and I'll drop it into the network, and then I know things can talk to it over IP or over Ethernet or whatever it is. That was the only common insertion point that I had. But what's been super cool from a almost purely technical perspective is you've actually seen a maturation of abstractions and somewhat of a unification of software within the enterprise, which allows you to insert infrastructure like core infrastructure as software. And this is at all layers of the stack, whether, let's say, it's the hypervisor or the operating system or platform as a service or, say, the cloud management layer, like, for example, OpenStack, right? And so this is kind of one of these few times where if you start a company, you say, you know what, I'm not going to go ahead and ship sheet metal. I want to build all of my functionality in software because that's what I'm good at. And I'm just going to target Linux, maybe just insert in KVM, and I'm just going to integrate with OpenStack. There's a market there that is sufficient for building a company, and this is a very, very new thing. And so I had my experience with this with a company called Nicira that I was one of the co-founders of. And at the time that we started Nicira, I mean, the prevailing wisdom is the only way to take networking functionality and to ship it was to wrap it in a box. I mean, I remember very clearly. I was like, we were raising money. I just finished my PhD. And we're raising money. I'm like, it'd be so great if networking can be done in software. And I was meeting with one of our investors who ended up being like a fantastic supporter of ours. But at the time, I met with one of the investors who was at the Rosewood right off of Sand Hill. I remember he was like, Martin, you're a really excitable kid. You're probably a smart kid. We're happy to support you, but like, nobody knows how to acquire software as far as infrastructure functionality. Like, in my heart of hearts, I know that you're going to have to put this thing in appliance eventually because that's all the channel knows, and it's all operators know, and everything else. And at the time, that was largely true. I mean, like 5 years of kind of hacking things out with a small team later, you learn what that means. But in the end, you end up with a product that does hundreds of millions of dollars a year and has built billions of dollars worth of value. And this isn't limited to networking. I mean, that networking's largely been my experience. But if you look at most layers of the stack today, whether it's security, storage, network, or compute, you have companies disrupting very, very large verticals with software-only solutions, and solutions that just 5 to 10 years ago would certainly have been wrapped in sheet metal somewhere. Okay, software-defined is rad. It's rad because you've got innovation cycles of software. It's rad because you don't have to deal with hardware supply chains. But shipping software is not rad for reasons as well. So for those of you that have shipped software, I've shipped a lot of software, you end up with software on customer premise, which is like the mother of all cache consistency problems, right? You've got heterogeneous environments. You may or may not have skilled operators. You have different versions that are out there. Remote debugging is very difficult. I mean, shipping software comes with, some sort of operation and post-sales overhead just to maintain. Often in large software companies, a bulk of the R&D is just maintaining many different versions of the core product because you can't really manage the upgrade cycle of the customer. And so the next trend I want to talk briefly about removes this. And that is, you're seeing now infrastructure, not just software infrastructure, move from on-prem deployments to services. So when I started the kind of talk about these trends, I said, okay, so in the early 2000s, consumer devices went from fixed function to basically apps on a ubiquitous platform. So we're seeing the same shift now in infrastructure that you saw in enterprise applications in the late 90s. And this is when you went to these kind of very complex on-prem deployments that you need a skilled operator. You probably have some HCL. You probably actually didn't test everything against that HCL matrix. You have to have these remote debugging tools. You've got these post-sales operating teams. And all of this has to be sunk by the company to software as a service, which clearly deals with all of these problems. I know you guys are aware of this. And so it turns out if you look across a number of companies, what they've done, especially startups, is they've used these kind of unification of abstractions and unification of APIs and insertion points to offer actual core infrastructure as services. And the canonical example of this, of course, is AWS. But I would actually encourage you to look out and see how pervasive this has become and how innovative some of these companies are. So here's a number just from our portfolio alone. There's many others. And so let me just do just a quick checkpoint on so far. So in the past, if you were going to build a company in the infrastructure space, it's most likely you had to have a very large engineering team. It's most likely you would have to get maybe 2 to 4 year runway in order to build something, stick it in hardware. You'd have to invest a tremendous amount of dollars in building up the inventory and getting the supply chain working. And then once you got it deployed, it's quite likely you'd have to have a fairly serious post-sales effort, right? And that's because you have to do all of this management of the software on-prem. And because of these last two trends, all of that has kind of gone away. So at this point in my talk, you guys, you're listening to me, you're like, this sounds amazing. I'm going to go do my software startup because Martin, everything you're saying makes a ton of sense. I'm going to go build my startup. I'm going to do it in software. I'm going to go ahead and ship it as infrastructure. Is that all you need to do? And the answer is no, unfortunately not. So there is a lot of expense in doing kind of more of a hardware-based supply chain. There is a lot of expense in doing the post-sales operation. But it turns out one of the most difficult things for a startup to do is actually go to market. And so there's been a lot of discussion about this, especially how this is shifting, but I think that it's a fairly nuanced point, so I want to spend some time there. So let's say you go down that, you go off and do whatever, Acme Inc., it's all in software, you're providing it as a service, and then you think that you're done. I mean, the reality is in the past, it's been very, very difficult for startups to actually get access to the customer in a meaningful way. I'm actually going to skip this slide really quickly. So here's why. The reason is the incumbents really have sewn up the go-to-market space. Almost every aspect of it is a hurdle or a barrier to entry for a startup. Let's talk about relationships. Lots of incumbents, or many of the incumbents have, 100 years, which is strange because they started off before, say, the internet existed, relationships with customers, and at least decade-long relationships. And these types of relationships transcend an individual salesperson. It'd be nice to say, oh, I can hire salesperson X, and that salesperson X has a long relationship, but that doesn't matter nearly as much as I've worked with this company for 3 decades, and they've delivered every time. And I know the CEO. Procurement processes for large companies are incredibly complicated and baroque and sophisticated. Often, infrastructure products go along with certifications. And the certification is, it's almost like a training manual. It's to the point that when people do it, it's almost like taking a class. They get a number, CCIE, whatever, and then they put it on their business card because it gave them a raise. And anything that doesn't follow that is going against that. The big companies have relationships with analysts that are long-standing. They've educated the analysts understand them. They've locked the channels. Think about how much leverage a large company has selling through the channel. Billions of dollars of leverage that they can use to lock the channel in. And of course, they've built all of the stuff that you need for day 2 operations. So in my experience, building an enterprise company and taking multiple products to market is the most difficult thing to do, in addition to the R&D. It's just be able to get access to the customer and sell the thing. So there is this big shift going on, which is the movement of influencing power from operations to the developer. And that changes everything, and I want to describe why. So my first job out of undergraduate was working in a national lab doing computational physics. And at the time, I mean, I was a computer scientist, I was a programmer, I was a computational physicist, and I didn't have budget for a pencil, right? I mean, like, basically, I would get whatever core IT provided me, and I would develop on that, and I didn't even have root on my own machine, and that's what it was. But if you listen to this talk, I'm basically saying infrastructure is going to the domain of developers, right? It's going into software, you've got good abstractions, it's delivered as a service. And because of that, it's largely moved into the domain of developers. And so developers may not have budget, or maybe they just have a little bit of budget, but these days they control a lot more of the budget than they have in the past. And this really changes so much. And the reason is their aesthetic, their buying methodology is so different, right? They don't care so much about analyst reports. They don't care so much about certification and training. I've never seen a developer with a certification on their business card. I've seen very few developers with business cards, right? What do these guys think about procurement? Developers. Procurement for a developer is drive home, good idea, swipe credit card, get infrastructure, right? They don't care about long-standing relationships with salespeople. They don't care about these very baroque procurement processes. So you start to think, so what do developers care about? Well, they care about community. They care about architectural elegance. They care about open source. They care about very low friction to buying because they've been trained that way. So they care about things that the old way of doing procurement just doesn't really know how to do, correct? And I would argue that they care about things that are very much in the domain or very advantageous if you're a small technical startup, because you do all of these things necessarily anyways. And that's probably the largest disruption of them all. So what we've seen lately throughout the industry, I know that you know them, but it's worth pointing, is this kind of Cambrian explosion in developer-centric startups, where within months or years, I mean, they're starting to almost look like consumer companies where an open source project or some appeal to the developer will create a phenomenon overnight. And this, I think, more than anything, is going to shape what the infrastructure or the industry is going to look like in the next 5 years. Okay, so I'm going to do one caveat before I get to the slide. So here's the one caveat, which is, just because you have credibility in an account, just because you have an open source project, doesn't mean you're going to be able to sell your product. And so this is a little bit of a nuance, and sometimes I refrain from saying it, but I want to say it here, because I certainly know this audience will understand this, which is, if you're doing open source and you're attracting the developer, what you're really subverting is the product marketing, not sales. So it's my experience that you can get access to the account, you can get account traction, you can get champions within the account. It's almost like filling the top of the funnel, but actually building a real revenue-generating engine almost always requires a direct sales force. Not always, some people have done it without it, but generally it does. And so it's kind of our belief, certainly at Andreessen Horowitz, that you can get credibility, get to market, get traction through open source, through community outreach, but that doesn't obviate the need for building an actual sales function on the back end. Okay, so one of the main components of this, one of the main drivers is, of course, open source, right? I mean, this is one of the most proven ways to kind of subvert the channel and subvert like all of the marketing stuff and the billboards that have happened in the past. If you do an open source project, companies know about your stuff, they're using your stuff. The problem is traditionally, those companies that went all in on open source had a very difficult time monetizing, right? We all know this. I think something like $7 billion of venture investment has gone into open source, and something like $1 billion of returns has come back, right? Not the best investment. So I think that we're actually now in a period where it looks like we've evolved what it means to build an open source company. We're starting to see some excellent examples of profitable, or at least high revenue generating open source companies. So the old model was basically being a support company, right? Like everything is open source, you become the natural monopoly, and then basically you're a service and support company. And that was the traditional model of doing this. A number of companies have been successful, very few, but a number have been successful. More often than not, the company would get some sort of traction and get acquired, but you didn't build these kind of long revenue-generating companies that stayed public and independent for long periods of time. So here's the change that we're seeing. Remember the second trend I talked about, moving things as a service? So what we've seen as a change is many companies will use open source to get access to the customer base. They will use open source to provide something of value. They'll use open source to get credibility, get a core user base. But the actual commercial offering that they offer is a service. And the service may or may not be open source. Often it is a very proprietary thing that is built on the back end. But generally when you're talking about services, because services is no longer software, it's more of a protocol. When you talk about services, you normally talk about standards and open APIs. You don't talk about open versus closed source, right? I mean, this is kind of the movement from software to a protocol or software to an interface. And when you do this, often you could actually get away from discussions about is this closed or open source, and more to like what is the service offering, what is the SLA, how standard are the APIs, how often you open it, like what is the elegance around this, do you version things correctly, and so forth. And companies that have been doing this, and we've been tracking them now for 5 to 6 years, have become enormously successful. So, I mean, here's an example of a couple of them. I'll just call out GitHub, right? I mean, GitHub, they didn't even build Git, right? But they certainly are drafting behind a very large open source movement. You've got a very successful company that generates a lot of revenue. So we're certainly very excited about it. And more we're seeing this happen where talking to the developer, there's some open source offering. That open source offering is either used to get initial traction or on the back end used to build out the service. And then based on that, you can build actually a company. So I do think that now we've kind of unlocked the code of what does it mean to build an open source company. There's a number of examples. I encourage you to look at them. I encourage you also, I think many of us, I think it used to be an old canard in Silicon Valley. It's like, okay, yeah, you know, I hear you're going to be the Red Hat of X, but only Red Hat has ever been the Red Hat of anything. I think this is changing now, and I think this is exciting certainly for everybody in this room. So just a couple of capstone comments. When I'm talking about infrastructure, this isn't just networking, this isn't just security. I don't think that there's any vertical that's safe from this disruption. And to be very clear, we're talking about trillions of dollars of market cap, probably tens of trillions of dollars of market cap. Certainly hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue are all going to be disrupted. And like I said, when I opened this up, when these disruptions happen, you almost always get new technology that pervades and a new set of entrants. And so I don't know what the next set of companies are. I don't. But if you have a good idea, please come talk to us. So guys, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
We still have time for some questions, by which I mean we have no idea where our next speaker is.
Oh, fantastic. Hey, I'm happy to take it. Yeah.
Are there any particular ideas that you're looking for?
So the question is, are there any particular ideas that you're looking for? Which is a great question. So in general, in my experience, I mean, you know, I've only been a VC for 4 months, but all of the conversations, no, it's a great question. All the conversations internally is all about empowering the entrepreneur. And I think that any VC that had deep ideas of what they're going to do would be sufficiently convicted enough to go do it. I think that what you want is people that understand what they're doing, that follow general trends at a high level. And so generally, at least the way that we work, you've got broad investment theses, and they follow these broad trends. And then you get convicted entrepreneurs that believe that they can build a company out of that, as opposed to kind of the opposite, where there's a specific idea and you want someone to go ahead and fill that gap. Because ultimately, having done it, starting companies is really hard. I have enormous respect for any entrepreneur that's going to do it, enormous respect. I know how hard it is. And I think that they have to be 100% invested in the idea they're doing, 100%. Yeah? That's a great, great complicated question. So the question was, heard the Red Hat CEO, only 5 software companies made more than $1 billion. I think it may be 6. Let's say 6, 7, something like that, make more than $1 billion, and then is software scalable? So here's something that's very interesting just in general when it comes to markets and open source, which is it tends, markets and software. It tends to be as you go up stack, markets fragment, right? That's why, and so you always look at these kind of common wastes where they don't fragment. And so I think that fragmentation happens more as you move into the application layer. I don't think this is an open source, closed source thing. I just think that this is where the industry is going right now. So much, like, it feels to me that a lot of the companies, certainly we see, is they're implementing things like security or storage or networking or something like that at the application layer, and that's necessarily very fragmented. It's fragmented by language, it's fragmented by user base, et cetera, right? And so I do think that we're going to see a lot of fragmentation, which means a lot of smaller companies. That said, it also seems to me that there's new opportunities to build like the platform. There just tend to be very, very few of those. So I don't think this is necessarily an open source dynamic as much as it is that we're moving up stack, and I really do think we're moving up stack, and I think we're still trying to understand what that means. But I think it's a great question that we'll be able to answer much better going forward. Yeah.
Martin, a great talk. By the way, so in the application space, things such as Salesforce had a marketplace, and they tried to build an ecosystem around that. Do you see a similar kind of trend happening when infrastructure becomes as a service, the need to have a large ecosystem of other applications that work on that infrastructure?
Yeah, this is another great question, and it's because the following. I mean, I think that especially technologists, there's always this prevailing wisdom that if you build a platform, then somehow an ecosystem will come. And pretty much every example I've ever seen is the exact opposite. Like, product always precedes platform, right? Always, right? Like, if you don't have a product, you don't have an initial market. When you don't have an initial market, you don't have what you need to attract an actual ecosystem. And so I think ecosystem, and I talk about ecosystem broadly as like tech partners and those building on top of it and adding additional value, that's a way to persist. But to go from 0 to $100 million in revenue, I think you need a clear product with clear ROI or like some clear set of value and clear deployment criterion. And if there's like one, I think, mental fallacy that I often see is you have a core technology like this is the most elegant thing ever, and I can use my Lego piece to like build entirely new universes, and then if I leave this out on a sidewalk, someone's going to see my Lego pieces and they're going to see how valuable it is and they're going to start building on it. And that just doesn't seem to happen. So I think this is a great question, but what I would say is product first, ecosystem second.